The air in the grand concert hall felt heavy, thick with a kind of polite boredom that only happens at long events. It was the final evening of the Regional Youth Music Showcase, and the excitement had faded hours ago. The program had dragged on since the morning, and now, as the sun dipped below the horizon outside, the massive crystal chandeliers inside were doing their best to keep the room bright. But even the lights couldn't wake people up. The audience, a mix of parents, music teachers, and curious locals, was shifting in their seats. The velvet cushions were worn down from years of fidgeting. You could hear the occasional cough, the rustle of programs being turned, and the low hum of whispers. Everyone was waiting for the intermission, desperate for fresh air or a cup of coffee. The judges sat at a long table on the stage, looking tired. They were seasoned musicians, experts who had heard thousands of students play the same songs over and over again. Their faces were stiff, hiding their fatigue behind expressions of professional patience. Then, the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, echoing off the high ceilings. He called out the name of the next contestant, Lara. There was a ripple of movement, but it wasn't excitement. It was just people checking their watches or turning their phone screens off. The name meant nothing to them. In the world of competitive piano, the winners usually had a reputation that preceded them. They walked in with confidence, wearing formal gowns or tuxedos, looking like they owned the stage. But when Alara walked out from the side curtain, the reaction in the room was subtle but noticeable. She looked completely out of place. Alara was a teenager. Slight in build, with her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wasn't wearing a shiny dress or high heels. Instead, she was dressed in a comfortable, loose-fitting sweater and ordinary trousers. She looked like she had just come from a library or a walk in the park, not a high-stakes competition. As she walked across the wide stage, her steps were quiet, lacking the aggressive strut of a performer trying to command attention. The judges looked up from their papers, scanning her appearance. One older judge in the middle, a man known for his strict adherence to tradition, adjusted his glasses and sighed almost imperceptibly. He leaned back in his chair, exchanging a brief glance with the woman sitting next to him. It was a look that said, "Here we go again." Another amateur? They expected easy notes. They expected a simple, perhaps slightly shaky performance of a nursery rhyme or a basic folk song. They assumed she was a beginner who had signed up for the experience. Not a serious contender. Alara reached the center of the stage, where the grand piano stood like a dark, shiny beast. It was a Steinway, massive and imposing. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at the instrument. The silence in the hall grew deeper. The audience members who were whispering stopped, sensing the stillness. But it wasn't a respectful silence. It was the silence of people waiting for something to end before it began. A few people slumped further into their seats, preparing to zone out for 3 minutes. She sat down on the bench. It was a long bench, designed for anyone, but she looked tiny sitting there. She didn't adjust the microphone or look out at the crowd to smile nervously. She kept her eyes fixed on the black and white keys. Her hands rested in her lap for a moment, fingers relaxed. To the judges, this looked like hesitation. They checked their scorecards, pens hovering, ready to mark down lack of stage presence or nervousness. The thing about expectations is that they act like a blinder. When you think you know what is going to happen, you stop seeing the details. The judges saw a shy girl in casual clothes. They didn't see the calmness in her posture. They didn't notice how she didn't tremble, even though the air conditioning was making the curtains sway gently. They didn't see how she touched the wood of the piano, with a familiarity that suggested it was an extension of her own body. The man sitting in the front row, a music teacher who had brought his own students to compete, leaned over to his wife and whispered, "Probably going to play Heart and Soul." "Simple stuff," he chuckled softly, confident in his prediction. His wife nodded, already looking at her phone to check the time. The people around them were thinking the same thing. The bar was set so low that it was practically on the floor. They weren't ready for a challenge. They were ready for a nap. Alara took a deep breath. Her shoulders rose and fell slowly. In that quiet moment, before a single sound was made, the atmosphere of the room began to shift imperceptibly. The air pressure felt different. The bored chatter of the crowd seemed to hit a wall. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but a subtle change in energy that the subconscious mind picks up before the conscious mind does. She lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. Her left hand hovered over the lower octaves. Her right hand settled in the middle. The judge with the glasses tapped his pen on the table, a sign of impatience. He wanted this over with so he could go for a break. But Alara didn't play. She waited. She waited until the last cough in the audience died away, until the last shuffle of feet stopped. She let the silence hang there, heavy and stretching, until it became uncomfortable. Until people were forced to look up from their laps and wonder why she wasn't playing yet. She was commanding the room without saying a word, simply by refusing to fill the air with noise immediately. The teenager on the bench sat perfectly still, her eyes focused on a point just beyond the music stand. She wasn't thinking about the judges or the bored audience or the low expectations. She was thinking about the sound she was about to create. She knew what they saw when they looked at her, a child, an amateur, a filler act. She knew they expected easy notes, safe notes, boring notes. She felt the skepticism radiating from the front row like heat from a fire. It didn't scare her. It fueled her. The tension in the hall snapped tight like a rubber band. The judge lifted his head, annoyed by the delay. The audience member in the fifth row stopped scrolling through social media and looked at the stage. Ilara's fingers tensed slightly, finding the right pressure points on the ivory keys. She was just a heartbeat away from shattering their reality. They were sitting in the calm before the storm, completely unaware that the sky was about to fall. She pressed down, and the world was about to change. The silence in the hall stretched on, heavy and thick, like a blanket of snow that had fallen over the entire audience. It wasn't a comfortable silence. Usually, when a performer sits down, there is a rustle of expectation, but this was different. People were confused. The girl on the bench, Ilara, was not hurrying. In the world of amateur recitals, students usually rush to start. They sit, they panic, and they play the first note they can find just to get the ordeal over with. But she wasn't doing that. She was taking her time. It was making everyone uneasy. She reached down with her right hand and adjusted the height of the bench. It was a small, practical gesture. She lifted the leather seat slightly, thump, and then tested it again. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly how they needed to sit to reach the keys. This wasn't the nervous fidgeting of a beginner. It was the calculated preparation of a professional. The sound of the bench adjusting echoed slightly in the quiet room, causing a few heads in the front row to turn. The bored judge in the middle, the one who had been ready to dismiss her, stopped tapping his pen. He narrowed his eyes, watching her hands. Ilara didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look for her parents in the front row. She didn't look for reassurance. Her gaze was fixed entirely on the piano. It was an intense, private focus that created a wall between her and the hundreds of people watching. To her, the hall was empty. It was just her and the instrument. She lifted her hands and hovered them over the keys, letting her fingers dangle loosely for a moment. Shaking out the tension, the audience began to lean forward in their seats, just a little. The collective boredom was starting to crack, replaced by a mild curiosity. Why was she waiting? What was she thinking? The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, a constant drone that usually went unnoticed. But now it seemed like the loudest thing in the world. The man in the fifth row, the one who had predicted she would play a simple tune, put his phone completely away. He felt a strange compulsion to watch her hands. They looked strong, the fingers long and slender. Slowly, Ilara placed her left hand on the low keys of the piano. She didn't press them down yet. She just rested her fingertips there, feeling the cool ivory. Then, she placed her right hand in the middle register. She took a deep breath, her chest expanding, and then let it out slowly. Her posture shifted. Her back straightened, her chin lifted, and her shoulders dropped. In that split second, she transformed. She wasn't a shy teenager in a sweater anymore. She was a musician about to speak. She pressed down the first key. It was a single note, deep and resonant. The sound rang out clearly, cutting through the dusty air like a knife. It wasn't loud, but it had a richness to it that surprised everyone. The acoustics of the hall caught the note and carried it up to the ceiling, holding it there. She let the note sustain, letting it fade into silence naturally before she touched another key. Then came a second note, then a third. She began to play a melody. It was slow, gentle, and incredibly simple. It sounded like a lullaby, something soft and nostalgic. The tune was Moonlight Sonata, one of the most famous pieces in history. A collective wave of relief seemed to wash over the audience. They relaxed their shoulders. The judges relaxed their grip on their scorecards. They recognized the tune instantly. It was a standard piece, something every student learns. The skepticism returned immediately. "Ah, okay," the music teacher whispered to his wife. "Just the standard repertoire. She plays it well, but it's just the basics." They thought they had figured her out. They settled back into their seats, thinking they knew exactly what was coming. They expected the easy notes to continue. A safe and standard performance that would be technically correct but emotionally flat. They expected her to be careful, to be afraid of making a mistake. They expected her to play it safe. But Alara didn't play it safe. Even in the quiet simplicity of the opening bars, there was a ghost of something else. She played the simple melody with a touch that was so delicate, so precise, that it held the room captive. It wasn't just hitting the right notes. It was the way she hit them. She was caressing the keys, pulling a sound out of the piano that was warm and golden, not cold and sharp. The silence between the notes was just as important as the notes themselves. About 30 seconds in, something shifted. The melody was still the same, still recognizable, but her left hand began to move differently. Instead of just holding a simple background chord, her fingers started to add a subtle rhythm. It was a faint pulse, a heartbeat underneath the lullaby. It was barely there. A ghostly rhythm that added a layer of complexity that didn't match the simple song. The man in the fifth row tilted his head. He knew this piece. He had taught it many times, but he had never heard it played with this kind of undertone. It felt dangerous. The gentle melody was starting to feel like a mask, hiding something darker and more powerful underneath. The easy notes were becoming a trick. The judges, who were experts at listening, began to notice it too. The judge on the left, a woman with sharp eyes who usually looked stern, stopped writing. She looked up at the stage, really looking for the first time. She saw the girl's calm face, the closed eyes, the total lack of tension in her body. This was not the body language of a student struggling to remember the next measure. This was a musician in total control. The audience was completely quiet now. The earlier shuffling and whispering had vanished entirely. The only movement in the room was the slow rise and fall of the performer's shoulders. The air in the hall felt charged, like the static electricity before a thunderstorm. People were no longer bored. They were entranced, though they couldn't quite say why. It was the feeling of walking past a calm lake and knowing, instinctively, that there is a massive creature swimming just beneath the surface. Ilara's right hand began to glide faster. The simple melody started to flow, the notes bleeding into one another. The tempo remained slow, but the density of the music increased. She was adding more voices, more layers, filling the gaps of silence with intricate harmonies that were not written in the standard beginner books. She was improvising, weaving a complex web around the simple tune. The easy notes were gone. The lullaby was waking up. The judge in the middle put his pen down completely. He crossed his arms, a frown of concentration on his face. He was listening intently, trying to predict where she was going, but he couldn't. The music was leading him, not the other way around. He realized, with a sudden jolt of surprise, that he was holding his breath. Ilara opened her eyes. She didn't look at the keys anymore. She looked straight ahead, her gaze piercing through the back of the hall. The gentle expression on her face hardened slightly. Her fingers curled, ready to strike. The deceptive calmness of the first minute was about to break. She had lulled them into a false sense of security with the simple melody. Now she was about to show them what the piano could really do. The atmosphere in the room was no longer polite. It was electric. Every single person was locked onto her fingers, waiting without knowing why for the explosion. The gentle, rocking rhythm of the lullaby continued to flow, but the safe feeling it provided was starting to dissolve. It was like watching a calm lake suddenly ripple with a strange current. The audience was still holding on to the idea that this was a standard performance, a student trying their best to play a famous piece correctly. But Alara was drifting away from the written music in her mind. She was treating the melody not as a rule she had to follow, but as a clay she could reshape. Without warning, her left hand, which had been playing a slow, steady pulse, broke the pattern. Instead of holding the chord down, she struck it sharply and released it instantly. The sound cut through the air like a slap. It wasn't loud, but it was percussive. It sounded like a heartbeat, but a heartbeat that was skipping a beat. The music teacher in the fifth row blinked, confused. That wasn't in the sheet music. He knew this piece by heart. And he knew that a student didn't just decide to change the rhythm of the left hand in the middle of a competition unless they were lost. But Alara wasn't lost. Her eyes were closed, her head nodding slightly to a rhythm that only she could hear. She began to weave a new thread into the song. While her right hand continued the sweet, high melody, her left hand started to play a wandering bass line. It moved away from the root notes of the chords and climbed up the scale, searching for something darker. The sound became discordant. The notes clashed against each other, creating a tension that felt almost physical to the people listening. The judges exchanged genuine glances now. The polite boredom was gone, replaced by a furrowed brows and whispers exchanged behind hands. The judge in the middle, the one who had been so ready to dismiss her, sat up straighter. He realized that she wasn't making mistakes. She was doing this on purpose. The girl who they thought would play easy notes was rewriting the rules of the game in real time. Suddenly, Alara's right hand leaped from the middle of the keyboard all the way to the high treble. It was a jump of nearly 2 octaves, a distance that required total confidence and muscle memory. Her fingers landed perfectly on a cluster of high notes that sparkled like shattered glass. It was a run that didn't belong in a slow sonata. It was fast, intricate, and impossibly clean. The sound was cascading water, rushing and chaotic, yet completely under her control. The room gasped. It was a collective intake of breath, a unified sound of shock that rippled through the rows of seats. The man who had been checking his phone earlier dropped his device into his lap, his eyes locked on the stage. The spell of the easy performance was broken. This was no longer a student playing a song. This was an architect building a cathedral of sound right in front of them. Alara didn't stop there. She took the main melody, the simple tune everyone recognized, and she began to warp it. She changed the timing. Instead of playing the notes evenly, she started to delay them just a fraction of a second, dragging the beat behind the pulse and then rushing forward to catch up. It was a technique usually reserved for jazz clubs or blues bars, not a classical piano competition. It gave the music a human, aching quality. It sounded like the piano was crying, begging for something. The contrast was jarring. 1 second, the music was soft and vulnerable. The next second, her hands were crashing down on the low keys with a force that made the massive instrument shudder. The pedals on the floor, the ones she controlled with her feet, were working overtime. She was sustaining notes, blending them together until the air was thick with harmony. The sound was no longer just coming from the piano. It felt like it was filling every corner of the hall, vibrating in the wooden floorboards and the velvet seats. The complexity was skyrocketing. The listener could no longer follow just one tune. There were 3 or 4 different things happening at once. Her thumbs were carrying the main theme, while her pinky fingers were adding a shimmering decoration. High above, and her left hand was driving a completely different rhythm underneath. It was like listening to a full band playing together. But it was all coming from one person, 2 hands and 10 fingers. The audience was mesmerized. Skepticism had vanished, replaced by a kind of hypnotic fascination. People who had been leaning back in their seats were now leaning forward, elbows on their knees, mouths slightly open. They were trying to understand how she was doing it. It looked impossible. Her hands were crossing over each other, weaving in and out, a blur of motion. The speed was increasing, slowly at first, like a train leaving a station, and then gathering momentum. The easy notes were a distant memory. The music had become a storm. The dissonance, the clashing notes, was getting stronger. It created a feeling of suspense, like a movie scene where the hero is hanging from a cliff. Everyone was waiting. for the resolution, for the music to return to the safe, happy chord they expected. But Alara refused to give it to them. She held them in the tension, stretching it out, making the air in the room feel heavy and tight. She played a series of chords that were dark, minor, and heavy. The sound was ominous, felt like a warning. The judge with the glasses took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes as if he couldn't trust what he was seeing. He had judged hundreds of competitions. He had heard virtuosos play pieces that were technically harder than this, but he had never heard anyone take a simple song and turn it into something so profound and so difficult so effortlessly. It wasn't just about speed. It was about control. She was taming a wild animal with her bare hands. Alara's face remained calm, almost mask-like, but her body was swaying now. She was physically fighting the piano, wrestling the emotion out of it. Her sweater rippled as her arms pumped with the effort. The muscles in her forearms flexed, visible under the stage lights. She was pouring her entire life force into the instrument. The casual clothes she wore were soaked with sweat, but she didn't care. She had transcended the room, the judges, and the competition. She was in a zone where only the music existed. The tempo was fast now. It was racing. The melody was no longer recognizable as the gentle lullaby. It had transformed into a roaring river. The notes were pouring out of the piano in a torrent, a waterfall of sound that was deafening in its volume. The hall seemed to shrink around her. The walls disappeared. The only thing that mattered was the sound. She was pushing the piano, too, its limits, demanding every ounce of volume and resonance it could give. Just as the audience thought it couldn't get any more intense, Alara suddenly slammed her hands down on a massive chord that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. Then, instant silence. She cut the sound off with the dampening pedal, leaving the room in a sudden, shocking void. The vibrations of the chord lingered in the air for a split second and then died. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the loudest silence they had ever heard. It was the moment where the realization hit them all at once. They had been fooled. They had judged a book by its cover, and the book had exploded in their hands. The girl on the bench wasn't a beginner, playing easy notes. She was a master, and she was just getting started. The next level wasn't coming later. It was happening right now. She held the silence for a heartbeat, her hands hovering over the keys, and then she lowered her head and began to play again. But this time, she let loose the full fury. The silence that hung in the air after that massive chord didn't last long. But in that fraction of a second, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Before the last vibration of the sound could fade away, Alara's hands descended upon the keys again. This time, there was no gentle build-up. She didn't ease the audience back into the music. She exploded. What happened next was something no one in that hall had ever seen live. Not in a small competition, not in a grand concert hall. It was a level of musicianship that seemed impossible for a human being. She launched into a section of music that was blindingly fast, impossibly complex, and fiercely rhythmic. It sounded like she had suddenly grown 3 extra hands. The melody was still there, buried deep inside the storm. But it was surrounded by cascades of notes that rained down like crystal shards. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was attacking it. She was wrestling a demon and winning. Her posture was aggressive, yet perfectly balanced. Her body swayed violently with the rhythm, her ponytail whipping back and forth. The casual sweater she wore was now dark with sweat under her arms and down her back. She was working harder in that 3-minute stretch than most people work in a day. The physical exertion was visible in the corded muscles of her forearms and the way her shoulders rose and fell with every breath. The sound that filled the room was deafening. It wasn't just loud. It was thick. The harmonies she was creating were dense and colorful, blending classical structure with the raw energy of rock and roll and the complex improvisation of jazz. She took the simple song everyone knew and turned it inside out. She ripped it apart, piece by piece, and put it back together as something new, something wild. She was breaking rules that musicians spend years learning. Not because she didn't know them, because she had mastered them enough to ignore them. In the front row, the judges were frozen. The man with the glasses had completely abandoned his scorecard. It lay on the table, forgotten. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide behind his lenses. He was a man who had dedicated his life to music theory, to the rules of composition. But as he watched her hands, he realized that the rules didn't apply to her. She was playing in time signatures that seemed to shift from one measure to the next, speeding up and slowing down with a precision that felt like breathing. It was organic. It was alive. The audience was no longer sitting passively. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted from polite boredom to an electric frenzy. People were on the edge of their seats. Some had instinctively stood up, unable to contain their excitement. Drawn to their feet by the sheer magnetic energy radiating from the stage, a teenager in the back row, who had been listening to music through his headphones before the performance started, had ripped them off. He was staring, mouth agape, completely mesmerized. He didn't know anything about classical piano, but he knew talent when he saw it. And this was something else entirely. The most shocking part was the ease with which she played it. Her fingers were moving so fast that they were almost a blur, like the spokes of a spinning wheel. They leaped across the keyboard with an accuracy that was terrifying. She would jump from the deepest bass note to the highest tinkling treble note, landing with absolute perfection every single time. There were no wrong notes, no hesitations, no fumbles. It sounded like a recording, a studio production perfected by a computer. Yet it was happening right in front of them, raw and unfiltered. At one point, Ilara lifted her right hand off the keys entirely, letting her left hand carry a thunderous, rhythmic bass line that sounded like a drum solo. The piano shook under the force of her playing. The low notes vibrated through the floorboards and into the feet of the audience. It rattled the teeth of the judges. Then, her right hand came crashing back down, not with a melody, but with a percussive strike on the body of the piano, slapping the wood to create a sharp crack before diving back onto the keys to continue the flurry of notes. The crowd gasped again. It was a primal move, something unexpected. It stripped away the pretension of the classical world and replaced it with raw emotion. She was using the instrument as a tool for expression. It's not just a machine for making pleasant sounds. The music she was creating felt like a journey. She took the listeners through valleys of quiet sadness, where the notes were sparse and lonely, and then immediately hurled them up to peaks of chaotic, joyous noise. It was an emotional roller coaster. The stern judge on the left, the one who was usually so critical, found herself tearing up. She didn't know why. It was just piano music, but it felt like Ilara was telling her life story without saying a word. It was the sound of struggle, of hard work, of being underestimated, and finally proving everyone wrong. The complexity of the arrangement was mind-boggling. She was layering rhythm upon rhythm. While her thumbs were holding down the main pulse, her other fingers were weaving intricate patterns around it, creating a texture so rich that it sounded like an entire orchestra was hidden inside the piano. There were moments when the music was so dissonant, so clashing and harsh that it felt painful. But she always resolved it, bringing the chaos back to a beautiful harmony. Just when the audience thought they couldn't take it anymore, she was going next level in the truest sense of the phrase. It wasn't just about playing faster or louder. It was about playing with a depth of soul that is rare to see in anyone, let alone a young girl in a casual sweater. She was pouring every ounce of her being into the instrument. The connection between her and the piano was total. The machine was an extension of her nervous system. The thought in her brain traveled instantly to her fingers, bypassing any hesitation or doubt. As the piece reached its fever pitch, the energy in the room became suffocating. The air felt charged with electricity. The audience was breathing as one, inhaling when she inhaled, tensing when her muscles tensed. They were witnessing a miracle of coordination and spirit. The man in the fifth row, the music teacher, realized he was witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime moment. He knew that he would tell this story for the rest of his life. The day he saw a girl destroy the expectations of a room with nothing but 2 hands and a piano. Ilara's face was fierce now. She wasn't smiling. There was an intensity in her eyes that was almost frightening. She was in a trance state, her entire world reduced to the 88 black and white keys in front of her. She was playing notes that didn't exist in the sheet music. improvising on the fly, creating a masterpiece that would never be played exactly the same way again. It was spontaneous, dangerous, and beautiful. She began to build toward the end. The music grew louder and louder, filling every inch of the vast hall. It was a wall of sound, a tidal wave of harmony that washed over the judges and the audience, drowning out their thoughts, their prejudices, and their tiredness. There was only the music, and it was absolutely next level. The music reached a point of intensity that felt unsustainable. It was a roaring river of sound, a chaotic storm of notes that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Ilara's entire body was moving now, rocking back and forth with the force of her playing. The sweat was dripping from her forehead, but she didn't wipe it away. Her eyes were locked on the keys, her expression fierce and unblinking. She was driving the piano harder than anyone thought possible, pulling sounds out of it that were thick and rich and heavy. The audience was breathless, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm she was creating. It felt like the ceiling of the hall might lift off from the sheer power of the sound. And then, in a split second, she stopped the chaos. Her hands flew up the keyboard in a final, blindingly fast run, a glittering cascade of notes that climbed higher and higher, stretching the tension to its breaking point. Every person in the room leaned forward, subconsciously waiting for the crash. But instead of a chaotic crash, her hands came down on a single massive chord. It wasn't just a chord. It was a declaration. It was a wall of harmony that seemed to solidify the air in the room. She slammed the keys down with perfect synchronization. Using the weight of her shoulders to drive the sound deep into the soul of the instrument, she didn't let go immediately. She held the chord, letting the sustained pedal trap the sound. The strings inside the piano vibrated violently, creating a roar that filled every corner of the vast space. The sound was so big it vibrated in the chests of the audience members. It felt like a thunderclap trapped inside a box. It was the loudest, most definitive sound they had ever heard. Ilara sat there, frozen, her hands pressing the keys into the bed of felt. Holding the moment hostage, slowly, gracefully, she lifted her hands off the keys. The moment her fingers left the ivory, the sound was cut. She lifted her foot off the sustain pedal at the exact same moment, silencing the strings instantly. The roar vanished. What followed was a silence so heavy and so absolute that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. It was a vacuum. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. No one breathed. The silence was ringing in their ears, a ghost of the massive chord that had just been played. That single moment of quiet was louder than the noise had been. It was the kind of silence that demands respect. The dust motes dancing in the stage lights seemed to hang suspended in midair. The judges were motionless, their pens forgotten, their eyes wide. 3 seconds passed, maybe 5. It felt like an eternity then. The spell broke. It didn't start as a polite clap. It started as a shout. A man in the 10th row stood up and yelled, "Yes!" The sound was like a starting gun. The tension that had been building for the entire performance finally released, and the room exploded. It wasn't just clapping. It was a roar. It was a tidal wave of noise that washed over the stage. Every single person in the audience stood up at the same time. The chairs scraped against the floor, adding to the commotion. People were whistling, stomping their feet, and clapping their hands raw. The judges, usually the calm and reserved center of the room, were on their feet instantly. The man with the glasses was clapping so hard his palms must have stung. He wasn't smiling politely. He was grinning like a fool, shaking his head in disbelief. The stern woman on the left was wiping tears from her eyes with a handkerchief, clapping with the other hand. They had expected easy notes, safe and boring. Instead, they had been hit by a freight train of talent. They knew, without a doubt, they had just witnessed something they would never see again. On stage, Ilara seemed to shrink. The fierce, warrior-like presence she had while playing evaporated the moment the music stopped. She slumped forward slightly, catching her breath. Her chest was heaving, her sweater soaked through. She looked down at her hands, as if surprised to see they were still attached to her own body. The transformation was jarring. 1 second she was a titan of music. The next, She was a tired teenager again. She stood up slowly. Her legs were shaking visibly from the adrenaline and the exertion. She turned to face the crowd. The wall of sound hit her, the cheering, the shouting, the love. For a second, she looked scared, like a deer caught in headlights. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She gave a small, shy smile and offered a quick, awkward bow. It wasn't a theatrical, deep bow. It was a humble nod, a way of saying thank you without having to speak. The crowd screamed louder. They didn't want her to leave. They wanted an encore. They wanted to talk to her. They wanted to know how she did that. The energy in the room was chaotic and joyous. The air was buzzing with electricity. It was the complete opposite of the bored, stiff atmosphere that had existed just 10 minutes ago. She had single-handedly flipped the energy of the entire hall. The easy notes were a joke now. The memory of her casual clothes and her quiet entrance was gone. Replaced by the image of her hands flying over the keys, Alara walked to the edge of the stage to acknowledge the judges. The man with the glasses bowed to her. It was a gesture of deep respect from a master to a new master. He mouthed the words, "Thank you," clearly. Alara looked surprised, then nodded back, a blush rising on her cheeks. She turned and walked back to the piano, not to play again, but to collect her sheet music, which she hadn't even looked at hand, closed the lid as she walked off the stage. Her steps were heavy with fatigue, but light with relief. She disappeared behind the curtain, leaving the piano alone in the spotlight. The instrument sat there, innocent and still, as if it hadn't just been used to create a miracle. The applause continued for a long time after she was gone. People didn't sit down. They stood in clusters, talking animatedly, their hands flying as they described what they had just seen. The music teacher in the 5th row was talking to his wife, his hands trembling. "I've been teaching for 30 years, he said, his voice shaking. "I've never seen anything like that." She wasn't playing the notes. She was playing the soul of that instrument. The buzz in the room was undeniable. It was the feeling you get when you know you are part of history. The people who had been checking their phones, the people who had been cynical, the people who had expected nothing, all of them were united by the performance. They realized that they had come looking for a distraction, but they had found an awakening. As the hall finally began to empty and the lights were dimmed, the echo of that final chord seemed to linger in the air, a reminder that sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who will change your world completely.